Hello and welcome to the New Moon Tarot reading for the new moon that fell on Saturday, the 13th of March. This is a few days late, and in fact I've recorded this the day before I'm going to release it because, just to explain my process a little bit, I always draw one or two qualifying cards before I do the reading, just to make sure that I'm on the right track, it's the right time, that the conditions are right, all of those things. And really nearly all the time I get a yes, go ahead card. And for the first time in, I think, really a very long time, I very clearly got a card that said, no, just hold on a minute. It's not for now. It's not going to work. And I drew a qualifying card, and then it all sort of fell into place. And I actually drew a third card in terms of timing, and so it was very clear that I just needed to listen to the wisdom of the cards, or what they were reflecting, bide my time, and then release this a little bit later. And if you're interested, then the cards that I drew, the first card was the Seven of Discs, which is failure, and really that's as clear as it is, that that anything that you're going to do isn't just going to work at the, in terms of a reading, it just wasn't going to work. So in other words, it doesn't necessarily have to be failure, it's just simply a no. And then the qualifying card that I had was the Princess of Discs, who is this pregnant young woman. So again, something was gestating, it wasn't yet ready to be birthed. And then the third card that I drew was the Four of the Major Arcana, which is the Emperor. And I took that to be how long I have to wait, which is 4 days. I'm going to briefly explain, as I always do, what I do, how I approach the cards in terms of what they mean and the positions. 3-card reading. The first card is the foundation, something that has happened, that is in the process of happening. As you can tell, in terms of foundation, it's what underpins the second card, which is something that you're going to be facing, or that's going to be coming to you, meeting you in some way over the next 4 weeks and beyond. So the foundation lays the foundation for the current weather, which is card number 2. And then card number 3 is the agency or tool card, and that is where you are able to exercise some kind of impact, whether it's on yourself or your surroundings, or on the energy of the card itself as it manifests, so that you can interact with it meaningfully. And meaningfully doesn't necessarily mean that it's all going to be sunlight and roses, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it isn't. It's just that it will be meaningful to you in some personal but significant way. As ever, I am reading in real time with you, so I haven't had a look at the cards, and I'm just taking them from the top of the deck, which is what feels right this time, and I'm laying them out. So card number 1, card number 2, card number 3, which are now face down in front of me. And we are going to have a look now at the foundation card. So this is what has already happened, what is in the process of happening, that is laying groundwork or paving the way or some way preparing you for card number 2. And the foundation card is the Knight of Swords. Now, what I noticed straight away with the Knight of Swords, and you'll be able to see this hopefully in the accompanying images to the reading. If for some reason, by the way, you're listening on a platform that doesn't offer links, then I would suggest that you go to my website, integratedtarot.com, to the podcast section, and then you will be able to access links so that you can see the card images as I'm reading this and as you're listening. So the Knight of Swords is facing to the right of the reading. In other words, he is looking at the cards that are yet to be turned over. And what is striking about this is that instead of eyeballs in his open eye, when you can see he's on profile on, so you can only see his right eye, there is light coming from his eye, and it is beaming out in this sort of direct line that is leading into the next card, the central card. So I have a feeling that there is something, basically it's underlining what he is looking at and the card that we're going to be reaching next. But in terms of him, he's preparing the way in the reading itself to say pay attention, but also the quality of the Knight of Swords himself is in some way laying the groundwork for your experience this month or these next 4 weeks and beyond, readings never just end. Their impact never just ends after 4 weeks or with the next new moon. So the Knight of Swords, to explain this deck, which is the Röhrig deck by Röhrig, the Knight is the king in many of the other decks. It's not, so for example, the Rider-Waite-Smith deck, there is a king and then there is a queen and then a knight and a page. And in this deck, it's actually the knight and then the queen and then the prince and then the princess. So the knight is the king of swords. And this is a beautiful card. His cloak reminds me of Joseph's coat of many colours because it's got this sort of, it's muted, but there's a rainbow quality to it. And he's got this amazing headdress that looks like it's kind of got a doily cut out of it, but also a new moon, which is interesting. So you've got the dark moon that is there on his helmet. So there is something here about the Knight of Swords getting activated at the time of the new moon. And maybe, just maybe, this quality just needed to, It just needed to percolate a little bit, needed to develop a little bit. And that maybe his energy wouldn't have been quite so perceptible if I'd released this on the Saturday. It may not have been something that you could have related to quite as easily or immediately, if at all. So pay attention then to what may have happened over the last 3 or 4 days in terms of this kind of energy that the Knight brings in. And talking about that energy, I am going to read the words that come up on the card, because there are quite a few English words here that really sort of speak to what it is that the Knight of Swords is about. So we have here passion, flexible thinking, ambition, and straightness concerning aims, which is very clearly depicted in that beam of light that is moving straight out. It's interesting that the Knight of Swords is associated with passion here, but that also makes sense to me in as much as the Knight of Swords is the sort of fully realized yang quality of his suit. So passion in terms of, I think it's knowing oneself, knowing one's purpose and being fully committed towards it or committed to it. That is a form of passion. And that would then relate to ambition and flexible thinking, because the king or the knight in this deck has reached the level that he's reached in terms of individuation, in being able to express that part of him by enduring, by growing up. And part of that is to learn to be flexible. If you're dogmatic, if you just stick with one idea and then doggedly see that through to the bitter of bitterest ends, then it doesn't open your mind to the possibilities, not only that you might be wrong or that there might be more information forthcoming, but that there may be more to the story that augments what you already have, and also it augments it to the point where you can share it with others. So there is a sense of intelligence and canniness developing into wisdom. And wisdom is the ability to apply both of those in a very fleet-footed, quick kind of way. But that quickness of mind doesn't detract from the decisions that come out of it. In other words, wisdom is really the ability to think about complex matters on one's feet. There's that idea of Solomon. And the Knight of Swords is very often linked to Solomon, who had to make very, very difficult decisions sometimes, but there was a creativity to his decisions, and sometimes the decisions weren't straightforward. In other words, some of the judgments that he came to weren't necessarily quite as literal as people would make them out to be. There was an intelligence and an insight behind them that spoke more to the underlying issues rather than to the actual judgment that he was proclaiming. So the Knight of Swords is foundational. You may be tempted to attribute this to someone outside, particularly if you are a woman, because sometimes I think that women find it difficult to relate to this energy as something that they have in themselves. But while this energy may be coming at you from outside, and this is something I will often say, but it feels very clear that I need to say it differently or with more emphasis this month. there will be the quality of the Knight of Swords in you. So as much as you will want to, or may be tempted to, or it may seem fairly bloody obvious to you that there is a Knight of Swords in your life that is there, whether that is the positive aspects of the Knight of Swords or the shadow aspects of the Knight of Swords, and we will get to those in a minute. The Knight of Swords will also be in you, whether that is positive, whether it is shadow, or whether it's both. So this is something about owning your Knight of Swords, owning all of your Knight of Swords, owning the abilities that he confers upon you and the qualities that he embodies, and then also to be aware of where it is that those particular qualities can also act out in a particular way, can come out sideways, can reside in the unconscious and sort of play their tricks from there, and in some way then speaks to a lack of clarity, a lack of purity of thought. The Knight of Swords is really great in the fact that he has a very sharp mind and a sharp intellect, and it's a good thing that it is it's underlain with passion, because passion then suggests heart, and heart is the thing that then can be brought in as a form of discernment when perhaps his thoughts aren't necessarily as straightforward as he believes them to be. So the Knight of Swords is well equipped then to be able to shine that particular light on his own thinking as well, on his own decisions, his own intellect, and see where it is that he might actually be tripping himself up and maybe others in the process. So then passion, the shadow of that is lacking in passion, or a kind of passion that turns into zeal. That idea where the passion isn't contained, it isn't understood that it is coming from within, that it is that the most important thing is the feeling of it and the directing of it, but passion then becomes something that needs to be directed outwards immediately, that in some way, because you have these feelings coming up, that then they need to be acted upon out in your environment, instead of perhaps understanding that the best part of being knightly is to sometimes just be still for a while and see where it is that you can best apply your expertise and knowledge, and how best you can act from a position of seeing much more of the story than you otherwise would by just sort of jumping on your horse and galloping off, which is exactly what the prince would do, and then the prince kind of realizes that he's galloping off into the distance, and then actually as far as away from home as he wants to get, he realizes it's always just behind him. In other words, you can gallop and gallop and gallop towards something thinking you're going to go and try and change it, that you're there to crusade, that you're going out into the world, you're going to change the world, but then you realize that everything that you left behind deliberately so that you didn't have to face it is still right behind you. Home is, you carry home with you. And so therefore, some of that intellect then needs to be turned inwards. It needs to be inward searching. There needs to be a discernment about one's own thinking, about one's own feelings, and one's own history and one's own responsibility that one plays in one's life. Passion is, the shadow side of the passion then is a very outward-looking passion, or a lack of passion, and dispassion maybe, or passionless. Flexible thinking, well, the opposite of that is concrete thinking, inflexibility, dogmatism, trotting out the same phrases over and over again, and that then, that kind of gives lie to the fact that any thought has been put into it. Very often I will hear people who just become a parody of themselves when they just say the same things over and over again, and you can tell that it's sort of like a motor running in the background, but their heart isn't in it. And so there's that lack of passion. There's something there about being run by a particular thought pattern that has just concretized into something that is unable to take anything else on board. Ambition, well, lacking in ambition or over-ambition, ambition for its own sake, shadow qualities. And straightness concerning aims, well, some of the shadow qualities of that is being so concerned about a particular outcome that you're not really looking at what's going on around you. It's like the destination is more important than the journey, it's winning at any cost. Or straightness concerning aims is where, you sort of, there's a certain aimlessness. There is a certain lack of rigor and vigor and a certain lack of attentiveness to one's goals, to one's passion, to nurturing that inner flame and that inner idea that needs to have dedication and devotion to it in order for it to grow. You know, there is nothing worse than a Knight of Swords, a leader who lacks conviction and who lacks passion and also who lacks direction. And you can take any example, any number of examples that you want from history, recent history, not so recent history, where that has been apparent. But I think that what this reading is doing is suggesting that the knightly quality of swords, that Solomonic wisdom at its highest expression, is activated in you and around you. Yes, it may be in another figure. The Knight of Swords may be there in your life, but they will also be there to reflect something in you as well. So it is either about trying to find where he is, or if you know where he is, by aligning with him and being aware of where it is that that there is something that feels true for you, that's something that, but it also has a certain amount of measuredness, or where something slips into zealousness, or where something slips into a kind of crusading that where you feel driven along by something rather than you being in the driver's seat. So that's the foundation, and the Knight of Swords is in some way going to prepare you for the theme for this month, which is the Queen of Swords. How beautiful, we have a royal couple. That immediately says to me that there is the potential here for a really fruitful and natural meeting of minds, but also meeting of meeting of minds and hearts. It won't necessarily be romantic, but a meeting of sensibilities. That's at its highest expression. I mean, the Knight of Swords and the Queen of Swords are two sides of the same coin, really. It's the yang and the yin. Well, the Knight itself is fire and swords is air, so it's fire of air. And the Queen is water and swords are air, so it's water of air. So there's something about being complementary here, and complementary as in C-O-M-P-L-E rather than complementary, because they kind of finish each other off, or they complete each other. But the danger here is also then that if there is too much expression of one kind and then not enough expression of the other, that then there is conflict as well. So that's the interesting thing. I mean, if you look on the color spectrum, for example, complementary colors are the ones that are opposite on this wheel of colors, and in that way, they are opposites, and then therefore they complete. They provide the other side. You know, one of them is the dark side of the moon. The other side is the side that we see. Though that's not necessarily a great analogy, actually, because we can never really see the dark side of the moon. But what I'm saying is, it is two sides of the same coin. But the other thing is that opposites attract, but they also then, unless they are bringing out their fullest expression by themselves in their own unique ways, they can also piss each other off tremendously, because you get attracted to the quality of something that you don't feel that you have, and then it's about taking it and owning it for yourself, and then the very quality that you are attracted to in that other person can be the one thing that is the downfall of the relationship. So it is always this dance, it's this give and take. It is never living your life through something else. And I know that I'm talking about this in terms of partnership, but this can also be applied in terms of the way, if you bring it totally down to the individual as well, so let's bring it within, then it is also about the Knight of Swords paving the way for the arrival of the Queen of Swords, the fire paving a way for the heart, but when it comes to sort of the mind, and not having one eclipse the other, but to be able to find this dance, this balancing act. You can't mix them. This is the thing. They can't be mixed to create a sort of mix of Knight Queen. They have to exist independently and individually. So there is this constant tension, it's a constant tension of fire, water, fire, water, fire, water. which if you can not combine them, but if they work together, they can create steam, and then that can move things forward. But otherwise, fire can burn water out, and water can drench fire so that so that also gets extinguished. And so there is this interplay. And what's interesting is the Knight of Swords has very, very specifically got his view on the Queen, but the Queen is looking at us, looking at you. And there is these masks in front of the Queen. There's one very beautiful decorative one that's in the middle, but the sort of bigger one at the front is kind of plain, and then the Queen is underneath that with a very, very beautiful sort of blue half mask, and so the lower part of her face is revealed. And what I'm sensing here is that there is a need this month to get a little bit vulnerable. Get a little bit vulnerable about your thoughts, about what it is that you're thinking. Being sensitive to your own heart, but when it comes to making decisions. So in other words, this isn't a totally touchy-feely kind of environment. The Queen is still the Queen of Swords. This is about mind, but it is also about mind that isn't hard. It is mind that is open. It's mind that's flexible. It's not open-mindedness to the point where she kind of dissolves into the ether and becomes nothing. But rather there is here a calling to risk your thoughts, a calling to risk your ideas, a calling to combine a sense of thought with a sense of emotion. So in other words, you don't go in completely with your heart, but you don't go in completely with your head either. There is a calling to both. And if I look at the Queen of Swords, I'm just going to see if there's any writing on here that's in English. Rational, intellectual, logical, objective, certainty. Interesting that these are such sort of not heartless, but without heart words, given the fact that the Queen of Swords is water of air. And what I would say here is that I think that there is something here about finding the heart in your brain. I know it's sounding bizarre because these two things are very often viewed as opposite. You either think with your head or you think with your heart. And I know that there's sort of been a tendency nowadays to favour the fact that the heart is the one that you should be following. And I think that's getting a little bit mixed up with intuition, actually. I don't necessarily think that the heart is always the thing to follow, in the same way that I don't necessarily think the head is always the thing to follow. I think that there is a place where they both meet, and I think that that is the space between the Knight of Swords and the Queen of Swords, is to be able to express yourself and to be able to take in your environment in a way that is both logical but also open-minded, that is questioning and curious, while also being able to express itself in a way that is clear, but that doesn't leave out the emotive part of oneself. It's not about being a robot, and it's not about being Mr. Spock. It is about being able to apply things with passion, but without losing one's sense of center. And in the process of doing this, the Queen of Swords is then able to reveal herself more and more. And this will be an element of you that is coming to the fore. And I have a feeling that the Knight of Swords will be able to assist in this if he isn't zealous and gallops towards her, with his sword out going, oh my goodness, I'm coming here and I'm going to save you and I'll tell you exactly what to do, so don't worry, and it's not about that. I think it is about the Knight of Swords being able to shed light on the Queen of Swords, so that aspect of you that is analytical, that is logical, to be able to shed light on that other part of the thinking mind that is intuitive as well, that is insightful in a way that that does service to the fact that we are human. And then that comes forward And there is something that is then slowly revealed over the course of the next 4 weeks. And there is something here as well, I think, that's quite literally about dropping masks. One of the things that I've spoken about, the Queen of Swords, is the term of the true self versus the false self. And this is something that is prevalent in a certain area of psychology, psychotherapy, the true self and the false self. The false self also equates to personas, really, that Jung talks about. And these are the various guises, masks that we put on, some of them deliberate. So if you're an actor, you're putting on a mask. You know, if you're a salesperson, you definitely have a sort of spiel mask. If you're a teacher, you have a very specific kind of mask as well. So there are ones that we deliberately put on, but there are also masks that we wear that we don't realize that we're wearing. And some of them we wear pretty much permanently. We don't know that we're doing that, but I think that many of us who have these masks, and you know, we'll all be wearing several masks, and then sometimes we won't, we'll think that we're fine, and then we'll realize there's yet another mask. But what it does do is you tend to have a sense that you're not quite contacting the outside world or an aspect of yourself. So in other words, you feel ever so slightly removed from something that feels true or authentic. It's what is also known as the provisional self, as opposed to, the real self. And we can't be real all the time. Masks are very important. I'm not saying drop all of the masks. I don't believe that that's helpful. I don't believe it's possible. I don't even believe that it's something we should be necessarily aiming for. I mean, if you look at the Queen of Swords, she still has part of a mask, but it's really very beautiful. It almost feels like it's part of her, the way that it moves up into her hair, which are these golden feathers. But I think that there is something here about risking revealing parts of yourself that have heretofore felt too risky, maybe. That's a very charged word, that where you felt a little bit vulnerable revealing them, where it felt like it may just be too much for the person around you, too much for you, or in some way you've been held back because it's not what that other person has expected of you. It's not what they know about you. And I'm not necessarily saying that you have to. It's not like entering a confessional. I don't believe it's that at all. I think it's first and foremost about being aware of where it is that we do wear masks, and sometimes the masks that we don't know that we're wearing. Sometimes, if we put on a show and you suddenly realize, oh, why am I being that way with that person? Or why am I being that way with a group of people? Because I'm really not like that when I'm out with my friends or when I'm at home. And sometimes you may come to the conclusion that it's probably worth continuing that act because that's the way it is. Or sometimes you may realize that it's a barrier between you and getting to know the other person. So there is something here about losing those masks. But it's not a forced removal. It's not about tearing anything off and feeling so dreadfully vulnerable that that actually all you want to do is run away screaming. That's not it. There's something here about just tentatively trying on for size what it might feel like to say something or be something that reveals perhaps more of you than you have revealed before in those circumstances, if it feels safe to do so. And I think that last part is really important. If it feels safe to do so, because if it doesn't feel safe to do so, then somewhere the shadow knight, the shadow queen are at play. There needs to be a feeling of safety within yourself, first and foremost. But I also think that there needs to be a feeling of being held safely in the environment around you. And maybe we have to go back even a step further and say, if you don't feel safe, then maybe it's worth asking the question, which is also a revealing of oneself to oneself, is why are you there if you don't feel safe? So it's a really interesting reading, because I know a lot of people really struggle to get to grips with court cards. But I think, and I've written about this before, the reason why we struggle to get to grips with court cards is because it's a deliberate struggling. In other words, it's not because court cards are inherently difficult, but because we are looking at elements of ourselves. And our mediating ego, which resides very much in the unconscious, this mediating part of it, prevents us from doing that to a greater or lesser extent as one of those masks. It acts as one of those masks. It stops us from being too vulnerable. It stops us from having to deal with too much change, of rattling the status quo. But actually, the court cards themselves are interesting because they are aspects of ourselves, and very often those aspects are ones that we have yet to fully get to grips with. So the less that we can see and relate to a particular court card reveals that we have got more work to do around the qualities of that court card. If we can't relate to the Queen of Swords at all, well, then she is the perfect card for us. If we can't relate to the Knight, then he is the perfect card. And together they make a formidable couple when they work really well, but they have to work independently and interdependently. They cannot be dependent on each other. That is just not the way that these qualities work. So there you go. You've got the foundation of the Knight meeting the energy of the Queen. And now finally we get to the third card, which is the Tool card or the Agency card. This is something that you have within your arsenal of, I don't want to say weapons, actually. Arsenal is probably not the best thing, though. I haven't turned the card over, so it might be. But something that you have within your reach, inwardly or outwardly, that you can use to assist you in some way over the course of the next 4 weeks and beyond. And that is the Moon. So the Moon, learning to speak the language of water. That's it. That is the phrase that came to me, is learning to speak the language of water. So there is something here about the Queen of Swords where that watery aspect of her is key, and it's about learning to speak that, and also about learning to respect it. We may not understand it because the Moon and that watery nature it's connected to the unconscious. It's under the surface. The mind will never fully know it, even while it tries to reach to it. And then when it can't reach it, it writes it off as something possibly inferior. And that is not true. The idea of this watery nature, the unconscious nature, the idea of tarot, for example, divination, and I just wrote about this, about the idea that tarot is very often scorned, or not even scorned. I mean, scorn at least suggests that there is some kind of interest, but dismissed because it is intuitive. And I think we do ourselves a disservice, because intuition isn't always this diffuse, cotton woolly, not much help quality that we have. Intuition can be razor sharp, it can be very specific, and it can help in ways that are equally specific. It is just about being able to tune into the language without necessarily being able to understand it completely or to understand the mechanism. I think that the masculine in this, the Knight of Swords, wants to take things apart and see how they work. And the Moon defies that. I was talking about the dark side of the Moon. Maybe that was a good thing. The dark side of the Moon is not something we can access. We can't get our heads around there and see it, but it is there. And so the Moon is about learning to speak that language of the watery side of the Queen of Swords, to understand that it has value, that it can work with the intellect in a way that is really incredibly valuable and productive and useful. It's not going to just give you things that you can't use. You can use them in a very real way. But I think the problem with intuition as well is, first of all, it's written off as something that either doesn't exist, or you listen to it, but you don't trust it and apply it and work with it. And that is also doing it a disservice, is to stay as sort of watery and fathomless and uncontained as the ocean, when actually we have the ability, if we work with the metaphor of the ocean, to rise up in the point of a wave. You know, they always say that the unconscious is the ocean and we are the individual expressions of that ocean. Well, we are able to express that ocean in a particular shape and form. And there is something here about being able to express the watery nature of intuition in a particular shape and form. And that may come in the form of an idea, or how we speak, or what it is that we are communicating in other ways, whether we communicate it through our bodies, or whether it's something that comes to us inside, or whether it's something that we utter, that we say to others, that feels deeply truthful to us, but without any need to justify it. And that's the other thing, is that, you know, very often, again, intuition will be undermined by people saying, well, where's your proof? You know, where did that come from? You know, show me your workings. And that's you know, that's great if you're doing a mathematical problem. That's great if you can sort of go back and do your long division and see where it is that you got the answer from. But actually the moon requires trust, and it requires trust in the face of the unknown. There are things that we can know, and there are things that we can't know about it. And I understand why it can be scorned and scoffed at and laughed at, because, you know, it could just be any kind of untruth that's pulled out of a hat, or, you know, it could be our fears that are talking, it could be our hopes that are talking, it could be the shadow that's talking. But actually intuition, when it talks in a very specific way. And the only way to know that you are using intuition when you talk, you know, when you are talking, or to understand when it is that intuition is working through you, is to continue to work with it. And also to continue to work with boundaries, to understand that you don't just melt into, you know, everything, but that you do maintain boundaries, which is why swords are so important here, because swords are a very specific and hard-edged boundary. Brush your hand against a sharp sword and you will know about it. There's something here about swords assisting in being able to create boundaries, and those boundaries can sometimes be verbal ones. You know, words are boundaries. But it can also be a physical boundary in terms of, you know, you shall not pass. There is something here about boundaries and trusting intuition and that interplay with both of them. But most of all about trusting yourself to know when to reveal more of yourself and when you don't need to do that. I hope that helps this month. Very different reading from last month. I do notice, though, that we've now gone from the star to the moon. We did have the tower and then the star and then the moon. So that's interesting. So, and the moon is the thing that you can draw from. It's very much present at the moment. If you do have any questions, if you do have any comments, then please do get in touch. You can either reply if there are comments in the medium that you're accessing this, or you can also email me at sarah@integratedtarot.com. I may not always reply immediately. Sometimes it might take me quite some time to reply, but I read everything, and if there is a pressing question, I will tend to try and get to that sooner rather than later. But in the meantime, I will send us off with much love to you, and may you have a month that is insightful and reflective, and where you feel safe enough to reveal an aspect of yourself, even if it is just to you. Thank you for listening.